Being a night security guard is one of the most overlooked and misunderstood jobs in the world. Most people think it's easy, just walking around empty buildings and drinking coffee all night. But let me tell you, the things you experience in this line of work can haunt you forever. I've seen things that would make you question reality, things that keep me awake at night even now. Hi, I'm Jack. I'm 22 years old, and I used to work as a security guard in an old abandoned hospital in Michigan. This place was shut down years ago, but my company was hired to keep an eye on it because people kept breaking in to vandalize or explore. Honestly, I thought it would be easy money. I couldn't have been more wrong. On my first night, I showed up just before 9 p.m. The building was huge and falling apart. The paint was peeling off the walls, and the smell of mildew filled the air. The hospital was dead silent, except for the occasional creak of old pipes. My supervisor gave me a quick tour, pointing out the main areas I needed to check during my rounds. "Don't go messing around in the basement," he said with a nervous laugh. "That's where the morgue is. Creepy down there." I laughed it off at the time, thinking he was just trying to spook me. But as soon as I was alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone in that building. Every little sound, every groan of the floorboards, every faint rustle of the wind set me on edge. During my first round, I walked through long, empty hallways lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The shadows seemed to stretch and move, almost like they were alive. When I passed the door to the morgue, it creaked open slightly, as if inviting me inside. I froze, staring at it for what felt like an eternity, before finally deciding to keep walking. "It's just the wind," I told myself. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. On my second night, things started to get weird. As I began my rounds, I noticed little things out of place. A chair that had been tucked neatly under a desk the night before was now in the middle of the hallway. A pile of papers I'd seen stacked on a table was scattered across the floor. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe I'd remembered things wrong. But then I started hearing the sounds, soft footsteps echoing through the hallways, even though I was the only person in the building. By midnight, I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy. As I passed through one of the hospital's older wings, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A wheelchair that had been sitting in the corner suddenly rolled across the hallway right in front of me. I stood there, frozen, staring at the wheelchair as it slowly came to a stop. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just silence. Trying to shake off the fear, I pulled out my phone to record a short video. "All right, guys," I said, forcing a nervous smile. "This is where I work. Yeah, it's creepy as hell, but hey, someone's gotta do it. By the way, if you're watching this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'm gonna need all the support I can get to survive another night in this place." As I ended the video, I heard it. A faint whisper coming from the direction of the morgue. My heart started racing. "Just the wind," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But the truth, I didn't believe it for a second. By the third night, I was questioning my decision to take this job. Sleep hadn't come easy after the events of the previous night, and the thought of returning to the hospital made my stomach churn. But I needed the paycheck, so I showed up anyway. Everything felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and there was this faint metallic smell that hadn't been there before. I grabbed my flashlight and started my rounds, determined to just get through the night and go home. When I reached the main hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. A hospital bed was parked right in the middle of the corridor, its wheels squeaking faintly as it swayed back and forth. At first, I thought it might have been moved by a draft, but there was no wind in the building. As I cautiously approached, I realized there was something on the bed. A figure covered by a white sheet. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted to turn around and leave, but something compelled me to step closer. When I was just a few feet away, the figure under the sheet moved. Not a big movement, just a twitch, like a hand clenching into a fist. I froze, unable to breathe as the sheet shifted again. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Suddenly the figure sat up. The sheet fell away, revealing an emaciated, lifeless face with hollow eyes staring straight at me. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight, and ran as fast as I could back to the security office. When I reached the office, I locked the door behind me and tried calling my supervisor, but the line was filled with static and I couldn't make out a single word. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the phone. For the rest of the night, I stayed locked in that room, refusing to step out until daylight. After what happened with the bed, I was ready to quit. But when I called the security company to report the incident, they brushed me off. "It's just an old building," they said. "You're probably letting your imagination get the best of you." I didn't want to look weak, so I reluctantly agreed to come back for one more shift. That night, I told myself I would avoid the morgue at all costs. But as the hours dragged on, I started hearing noises, loud bangs and muffled voices coming from the basement. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the sounds got louder and more persistent. Finally, I decided to investigate. I told myself it would be easier to face whatever was down there than to sit in the office and let my imagination run wild. The stairwell leading to the morgue was pitch black, and the air felt colder with every step I took. When I reached the bottom, my flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, its back turned to me. It was tall and hunched, with long arms that dragged against the floor. My breath caught in my throat as it turned slowly to face me, its glowing, hollow eyes locking onto mine. Before I could move, it let out a guttural growl and started to run toward me. I panicked and sprinted back up the stairs, the sound of its heavy footsteps right behind me. I reached the main floor and slammed the stairwell door shut, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. But the scratching started immediately. Long, sharp claws raked against the metal door, and the growling grew louder. I bolted to the security office and locked myself inside. The sounds outside continued for hours. Scratches, growls, and the occasional bang. When morning finally came, everything went silent. When the sun finally rose, I felt like I had been granted a second chance at life. The noises had stopped, and the hospital was eerily quiet again. I unlocked the office door and peeked into the hallway, half expecting that figure to still be lurking, but there was nothing. The bed that had terrified me the night before was gone, as if it had never been there. I wasted no time calling my supervisor. "I'm done," I said firmly. "This place isn't just creepy, it's dangerous. Something is seriously wrong here." At first, they tried to brush me off again, but I refused to back down. I demanded to be transferred, threatening to quit if they didn't comply. They eventually relented, assigning me to a quieter, more routine job at an office building across town. On my last day at the hospital, I returned during daylight to collect my belongings. Walking through the now empty halls, everything looked normal. The eerie atmosphere that had haunted me at night was gone. For a moment, I wondered if it really had all been in my head. But as I reached the exit, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. On the dusty floor, right in front of the morgue door, was a fresh set of footprints. They weren't mine. I didn't stick around to investigate. I left that hospital behind, vowing never to set foot there again. To this day, I still have nightmares about those nights. The glowing eyes, the growling, the relentless scratching, it all feels just as real as it did back then. So if you're ever tempted to take a job in an abandoned building, think twice. Sometimes the things you guard aren't just objects. They're secrets best left undisturbed. You might wonder why I ever chose to become a night watchman of all jobs. Honestly, I wasn't looking for excitement or danger, just a paycheck. After getting laid off from the factory, I took what I could find. Watching over an old cemetery in a quiet little town here in Pennsylvania seemed like a no-brainer. Easy work, I thought. Nothing ever happens in a cemetery, right? I'm Jack Thompson, by the way. A simple guy with a simple life. But tonight, I'm here to share something that shook me to my core. A story I never told anyone except a close friend, and even he thought I was losing my mind. What I'm about to tell you isn't just another spooky tale to pass the time. No, this actually happened to me. It started on a chilly Friday night in October. I was doing my usual patrol, walking the gravel path that ran along the edge of the cemetery. Everything was quiet except for the wind rustling through the bare branches. That's when I saw them. Two women walking down the street barefoot, wearing long white dresses. Now, this wasn't exactly a place where people wandered around at night, let alone dressed like that. They looked out of place, but something about them felt wrong. Curious and maybe a bit uneasy, I decided to follow at a distance. They didn't seem to notice me as they strolled down the path, their heads slightly bowed, their movements almost synchronized. When they reached the cemetery gates, they stopped. I froze, watching from the shadows as they opened the gate without a sound and slipped inside. That's when it hit me. I was now officially spooked. But instead of walking away like any sane person would, I did the dumbest thing imaginable. I followed them. The air inside the cemetery felt heavier than usual, like the weight of the entire place was pressing down on me. The moonlight barely lit the crooked headstones, and the crunch of my boots on the gravel path seemed unnaturally loud. "Hello!" I called out, trying to sound firm but not too aggressive. My voice echoed back at me, hollow and lonely. No response. I scanned the rows of graves, but the two women were nowhere to be seen. They couldn't have gone far, I thought. It had only been seconds since they entered. I moved deeper into the cemetery, my flashlight slicing through the dark. That's when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched giggle like children playing hide-and-seek. My stomach tightened. "Hey, is someone there?" I demanded. The giggle faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of movement near one of the older mausoleums. I hurried over, my pulse pounding in my ears. But when I got there, nothing. Just a cold breeze and the overwhelming scent of damp earth. It didn't make any sense. There was no way they could have vanished like that. My instincts told me to leave, but my curiosity kept me rooted. I turned in circles, shining my flashlight across the grave markers, half expecting one of them to move. But everything was still. Eventually, I backed away, feeling more unnerved with every step. As I neared the gate to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned one last time, scanning the cemetery. That's when I heard it again, a giggle, faint but clear. Only this time it was right behind me. I barely slept that night. After leaving the cemetery, I kept replaying everything in my mind. Those women, the giggles, the way they seemed to disappear into thin air. By the time I finally drifted off, it must have been close to dawn. That's when the dream started. In the dream, I was back in the cemetery, walking the same gravel path under a pale moon. Everything was quiet except for the sound of my own footsteps. Then I saw them again, the two women. They stood side by side near an old oak tree, their faces partially obscured by shadows. This time, they weren't walking. They were waiting. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. One of them stepped forward, her head tilting slightly as if she was studying me. Her long black hair shimmered in the moonlight, cascading over her shoulders like a curtain. She raised her hand, motioning for me to come closer. Against my will, I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing right in front of her. She smiled, a smile that sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, her hair began to move, as if caught in an invisible wind. It grew longer and longer, twisting and writhing like living tendrils. Before I could react, the strands of hair wrapped around my neck, tightening like a noose. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The other woman stood in the background, watching silently, her expression cold and detached. My vision blurred as the hair constricted tighter, cutting off my air. I was suffocating, helpless, and completely paralyzed. Just as everything started to go black, I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air. My heart was racing and sweat drenched my shirt. But the nightmare didn't feel like a dream. It felt real, as if I had just escaped death itself. The room was dark, but something didn't feel right. My chest was still tight, as if the grip of her hair hadn't fully let go. I sat up, trying to shake off the dream, but then I saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then it moved. The figure stepped into the faint moonlight streaming through the window. It was her, the woman from the dream. Her hair hung lifeless around her shoulders, but her eyes glinted with a malevolent light. My entire body froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. As I sat there paralyzed, her hair began to move again, slithering toward me like black snakes. The room filled with a low, eerie whisper, words I couldn't understand but could feel deep in my bones. My instincts screamed at me to do something, anything, but I was trapped in my own body. In that moment of sheer panic, I remembered something my grandmother used to say: "When fear has you cornered, pray." Summoning every ounce of strength, I whispered a shaky prayer. "God, please help me, protect me." The whispers grew louder, angrier, but I kept praying, my voice gaining strength. That's when I remembered something else. Stories like this weren't just mine to tell. If you've ever felt fear like this, let someone else know. And hey, don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories like this one. You never know what's out there. As the words left my lips, the shadow began to fade. The tendrils of hair recoiled, shrinking back into the figure until it vanished completely. The room fell silent, and I was alone again. I collapsed back onto the bed, my body trembling, my mind racing. I didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was certain: this was far from over. The next morning I dragged myself to work, my body heavy with exhaustion and my mind clouded with unanswered questions. I couldn't shake the image of her, those lifeless eyes, that suffocating hair, and the whispers that still seemed to echo in the back of my mind. I told myself it was just a nightmare, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. When I got to the cemetery, I found George, one of the older groundskeepers, sipping his coffee near the office. George had been working there for decades and was known for his stories about the cemetery's past. If anyone would know what was going on, it was him. "Hey, George," I said, my voice strained. "You ever hear anything strange about this place? Like, I don't know, stories about people seeing things that shouldn't be there?" George squinted at me over the rim of his coffee cup. "Depends on what you mean by strange, Jack. Cemeteries are full of stories, most of them just people's imaginations running wild." I hesitated, wondering how much to tell him. Finally, I decided to just lay it out. "Last night, I saw two women. They walked into the cemetery, but then they disappeared. And later, I think one of them showed up in my room. It wasn't a dream, George. It was real." George's face paled. He set his coffee down slowly, his hand trembling just a little. "Two women, you say? Young, dressed in white?" I nodded, my stomach sinking as he spoke. "They're called the Oakwood Sisters," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Died here in the 1940s. They were hit by a car near the cemetery gates. Locals say their spirits never left. Some folks claim to have seen them over the years, usually around this time of year." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "So, what do I do? How do I stop them?" George shook his head. "You don't. You just stay out of their way. They don't mean harm, not usually, but if they show up, it's because they're trying to be heard. Maybe you're just unlucky enough to be the one they picked this time. I couldn't decide if his words were meant to comfort me or terrify me even more. That night, as I stood by the cemetery gates, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a strange calmness wash over me. I didn't know what the Oakwood sisters wanted or why they had come to me, but one thing was clear: they weren't done with me yet. And as the breeze rustled through the leaves, I swore I heard it again, the faint sound of giggles in the wind. Let me tell you about something that happened to me one night, a story I'll never forget. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you, creeping into your thoughts when the world is quiet. It happened during one of my shifts as a night watchman. And even now, I can't explain what I saw. Every time I think about it, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My name's Michael, and I've been working as a security guard for years. It's a job that gives you a lot of time to think, and sometimes too much time to notice things you'd rather ignore. I was stationed in downtown Savannah, Georgia, near an old historic theater. The area was beautiful, with cobblestone streets and flickering streetlights, but at night it had this eerie stillness. One night, just past midnight, I was doing my usual rounds. Everything was quiet, except for the faint hum of the streetlights. As I turned a corner, I saw something, or rather someone, out of place. A woman holding a small child in her arms was walking down the street. She was dressed in a long white gown that looked tattered and old, like something from another era. She was barefoot, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she wasn't in any rush. The child in her arms was nestled close to her chest, but what caught my attention was how quiet they both were. Not a single cry, not a word. It was strange enough to see a woman walking alone at that hour, but with a child, something about it felt wrong. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. My gut told me to stay back, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow her, keeping a safe distance. She walked down the street, her figure illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. Her movements were so slow, almost like she was floating. As I trailed behind, I tried to make out more details, but something felt off. The air around me grew colder, and the usual sounds of the night, crickets, distant cars, seemed to vanish. She turned into a narrow alleyway, and I quickened my pace, determined not to lose her. The alley was dimly lit, with shadows stretching out in every direction. I reached the entrance and peered inside. Nothing. She was gone. I stepped into the alley, scanning every corner, but it was empty. No sign of the woman or the child. The walls were brick, with no doors or windows where she could have gone. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized how silent everything had become. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. I even called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" But my voice echoed back at me, unanswered. Heart pounding, I retraced my steps, looking for any sign of her. It felt like the darkness was closing in around me, and for the first time in my years as a security guard, I felt truly afraid. I went back to my post, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next day, I couldn't get the woman and child out of my mind. I told myself it had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe she slipped into a doorway I hadn't noticed, or maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. When I got to work that evening, I decided to share what had happened with a couple of my co-workers, Brian and Charlie. Both had been working in the area for years, and if anyone knew something, it would be them. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, "have you guys ever seen anything strange around here? Like late at night?" Charlie, an older guy with a gruff voice, chuckled. "Strange? You mean ghosts? You wouldn't be the first to bring that up." Brian, who was younger and a little more serious, leaned forward. Why? Did you see something? I hesitated before telling them about the woman and the child. As I spoke, their faces shifted. What started as amusement quickly turned into something else, recognition. Man, Charlie said, shaking his head, you're not crazy. A lot of guys around here have seen her. Brian nodded. Yeah, people call her the Mother. The stories go back decades. They say she and her kid died somewhere near the old theater a long time ago. A fire, maybe. Nobody really knows for sure. I felt a chill run down my spine. So what does she want? Charlie shrugged. Who knows? Some say she's looking for something or someone. Others think it's just a residual haunting, like a memory stuck on repeat. The idea of this happening over and over gave me goosebumps. If so many people had seen her, why wasn't this story more widely known? Brian, noticing my unease, said, Hey, if you're into this kind of stuff, you should stick around. There's plenty more stories like hers. Actually, if you want to hear more about this, why not hit the subscribe button and follow along? We've got more stories like this one. I forced a weak laugh, but inside, I felt uneasy. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear more. I couldn't leave it alone. The thought of the Mother haunted me, and I felt this strange pull to learn more. That night, I went home and started searching online for anything I could find. It didn't take long before I stumbled across old news articles about the area. One story in particular caught my attention. In the early 1900s, there had been a fire in a nearby boarding house. The flames spread quickly, trapping a woman and her young son inside. Witnesses claimed to have seen her clutching the boy to her chest as the fire consumed the building. Her name was Mary Ellis, and her son's name was Thomas. The article said the site of the fire was only a block away from the theater where I worked. As I stared at the screen, a sense of dread settled over me. Could it really be her? Was she still wandering the streets, searching for peace, or something else entirely? That night, I returned to work with a plan. I wanted to see her again, to get some kind of answer. When my shift started, I made my way to the spot where I'd first seen her. The streets were quiet, but the air felt heavier than usual. I walked the same route she had taken, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I approached the alley where she had disappeared, I felt the temperature drop. My breath came out in clouds and the streetlights flickered. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement. I turned quickly, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. This time I didn't call out. Instead, I stood there in the silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen. It was just past midnight when it happened again. I was stationed at my usual spot near the theater, my nerves on edge. I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual since that night in the alley, but the air felt thick with anticipation, as if something was about to break the silence. Then I saw her. She appeared in the same spot as before, stepping out from the shadows of the cobblestone street. Her long white gown seemed to shimmer faintly under the streetlights, and the child in her arms was nestled close to her chest. This time, I noticed something new. Her head was tilted slightly down, as though whispering softly to the child. I froze. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away as possible, but something held me there. I had to know. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I called out to her. "Ma'am, do you need help? Are you okay?" She didn't respond. Instead, she began walking, her movements slow and deliberate, just as before. I followed, keeping a few paces behind, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. She led me down the same path as the first time, toward the narrow alley where she had disappeared before. But this time, she stopped. She turned her head slightly in my direction, and for the first time, I saw her face. It was pale, almost luminous, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. Her expression was a mix of sorrow and something else, something darker. "Why are you here?" I managed to whisper, though my voice shook. She didn't speak, but the child in her arms shifted slightly. That's when I heard it, a faint, echoing laugh, high-pitched and unnatural, like a child's but distorted. It sent chills down my spine. Before I could take another step, the streetlights flickered violently, plunging the alley into darkness. I stumbled back, fumbling for my flashlight, but when I finally turned it on, the alley was empty. She was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to process what I had just witnessed. When I finally made my way back to my post, I realized my hands were trembling. To this day, I don't know what I saw or why it happened to me. But every time I walk those streets, I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, wandering, searching for something or someone. Maybe one day she'll find what she's looking for. Or maybe she's just waiting for the next person to cross her path. You know that feeling when something just doesn't add up, but you can't explain why. That's exactly what happened to me the night I met Arnie, the night guard. Only later did I realize I wasn't talking to someone alive. Hey there, my name's Mike. I'm just your average guy, working long hours and living in a small town in Oregon. But tonight, I want to share something that's stuck with me ever since it happened. A story that I still can't fully wrap my head around. Maybe you can help me make sense of it. It all started one Friday night. I was coming back from a buddy's house, walking down Main Street around midnight. It was quiet except for the faint hum of streetlights and the occasional car speeding past. As I passed an old apartment building, I noticed a man sitting on a motorcycle near the curb. He looked like one of those typical night guards, dark uniform, flashlight clipped to his belt. "Hey, kid," he called out. His voice was calm, but carried an urgency that stopped me in my tracks. "Can I ask you for a favor?" I hesitated, but nodded. "Sure, what's up?" He introduced himself as Arnie and said he worked as a night guard for the building. "I need you to tell my mom something," he said, handing me a slip of paper with an address written on it. "Tell her I'm taking care of the payment. She'll know what it means." It was such a strange request, but his tired eyes and polite tone made me agree. I stuffed the note in my pocket and promised to deliver the message. Little did I know, this favor was about to unravel something far beyond my understanding. The next morning, I decided to make good on my promise. The address was only a few blocks away, so I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The house was a small, cozy place with a neatly kept yard. A typical suburban home. When I knocked, an elderly woman opened the door. "Hi, Mom. My name's Mike. I ran into someone named Arnie last night, and he asked me to deliver a message to you." The smile on her face froze. "Arnie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," I replied, a bit confused. "He said to tell you that he's taking care of the payment. He said you'd understand." Her eyes filled with tears. "Young man," she said softly, "my son Arnie passed away 3 days ago. He was in a motorcycle accident on his way home from work." I stood there, stunned. My brain scrambled to make sense of her words. "That's not possible," I stammered. "I spoke to him last night. He was at the building he said he worked at." Donna Celeste, yes, she introduced herself, looked at me with a mix of sadness and something else. Hope, maybe. "That building was his regular post," she said. "He was so dedicated to his job. Maybe his spirit, I don't know." I felt a chill run down my spine. Was I really talking to a ghost? The logical part of me wanted to dismiss it, but the way she spoke, the pain and sincerity in her eyes, told me this wasn't some coincidence. I couldn't shake the uneasiness as I walked back to where I had seen Arnie the night before. My mind raced with questions. How could I have spoken to someone who wasn't alive? And why would he still be at his post, asking for help? When I arrived, the street was as quiet as ever. The apartment building stood there, unassuming, and there was no sign of Arnie or his motorcycle. I asked a man coming out of the building if he knew Arnie. "Oh yeah," he said. "Arnie was the guard here. Good guy. Always took his job seriously, but..." He hesitated. "He died last week in a crash. A real shame." The confirmation hit me like a brick. I wasn't imagining it. This was real. I told the man about my encounter, and his eyes widened. "If Arnie showed up, maybe he wasn't ready to leave just yet," he said, half joking, but his tone betrayed a hint of fear. As I walked away, I couldn't stop thinking about how far Arnie's dedication went, even beyond death. It made me realize how much our responsibilities and connections define us. And you know, it's moments like these that remind me how fragile and mysterious life can be. If you've ever had a strange, unexplainable experience like this, share it in the comments. And hey, if you're into stories like this, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. You never know what other chilling tales might come your way. The next day, I visited Mrs. Celeste again. I told her I hadn't seen Arnie since that night, but reassured her that he seemed at peace when I spoke to him. Her face softened, and for the first time she smiled. "Thank you," she said. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Maybe he just wanted to let me know he was still watching over things, in his own way. As I left her home, I felt a strange mix of sadness and comfort. Looking up at the cloudy sky, I imagined Arnie finally finding the rest he deserved. And just like that, life went on. But every time I walk past that old apartment building, I can't help but glance at the curb, half expecting to see a man on a motorcycle, still keeping watch.